red on the top, green on the bottom. Nearly every traffic light on Earth is arranged in this way. And if you're from one of those countries or areas where this is not the case, I apologize. I see you and I respect you. But back to the traffic light, there's nothing about electricity or physics that requires red to be on the top. If you were to swap them, nearly every driver on the road would still stop and go exactly the same way. It would just feel odd. Now apply that same logic to B being on the left and A being on the right. That's the controller layout I started with, having grown up playing the NES. But I never really thought to ask why B would come before A. What's interesting is that Sega didn't agree with that layout. Neither did Sony or Microsoft. Nearly 40 years ago, Nintendo picked out a button order for your thumb, and nobody since has fully agreed with them on why. Now, before you just dismiss this as who cares, and honestly, I probably wouldn't blame you if you did, but hear me out on this. I'm the type of person that reads A and B like a sentence. So logically, it would seem that A should sit first on the left. And I guess that's a good counterpoint. A controller isn't a sentence. You don't read it, you just reach for it. So you can't really use that as an argument as to why Nintendo should have had A on the left and B on the right rather than reversing it. And in reality, nobody has ever gone on record explaining why Nintendo designed it the way it did. The honest answer is nobody knows for certain. There's only theories, and none of them confirmed. What's interesting, though, is when you dive deeper into the subject, the most interesting aspects of controller layout and design didn't start with the NES. They would actually come later. What you find is that designing for 2 buttons actually wasn't that difficult. It was 4 buttons when you started to run into a problem, and that's what the Super Nintendo introduced. Now, when designing a controller with 4 buttons, and you've already used A and B, and you want to add 2 more, logic would dictate that you would probably add C and D. Nintendo didn't do that. They went with A and B, and then X and Y. Further, on the North American controller specifically, the A and B buttons curved outward, convex, while the X and Y curved inward, or concave. So your thumb could tell the 2 groups apart without ever having to look at them. But why X and Y and not C and D? There actually was an explanation for this. In 1993, a letter to Nintendo Power asked this exact same question. And the answer was simple. X and Y were borrowed from CAD software, where A and B mark primary elements and X and Y mark secondary ones. 24 years later, in an interview, Shigeru Miyamoto basically said the same thing, that they'd split the buttons into 2 priority groups, and that's specifically why they didn't just call them C and D, but rather X and Y. So the labels told your brain there were 2 groups, and then the shape told your thumb which group it was touching. It seemed like an elegant system. The problem is, most games would use them in a way that wouldn't make sense. Nintendo would actually be one of the first to break their own button layout design. In Super Mario World, they put the jump button on B and the dash button on Y, which meant the 2 buttons that you would actually use the most while playing the game were not the primary B and A buttons that Nintendo intended them to be. I don't know if anyone else is weird like me, but on a modern controller, I like to put the dash button on B, the regular jump button on A, and the spin jump on Y. I feel this is much more comfortable and logical. Then take a game like Street Fighter II. It took the 4 weakest attack actions and put them on the face buttons. Meanwhile, the 2 strongest attacks were on L and R. This never made sense to me. Now, given I am not a Street Fighter II expert, But I always felt the two strongest attack buttons should be easier to access and therefore use the face buttons. Thankfully, Capcom included in the options the ability to reassign the buttons. However, you'd have to do this every time you restarted the game. This is just another example where button layouts didn't always make sense or the way they were designed to be used by the console manufacturer. And then there were RPGs. Some RPGs would use A to confirm your action, others would use B. And that could lead to some very frustrating moments. So the point is that Nintendo tried to control where a button lived, what it was called, what shape it was, but what they couldn't control was what a developer would do with it. And it never really went away because Nintendo continued to try different things. If the labels themselves couldn't hold things together, well, then maybe the shape of the whole controller could? The Nintendo 64 also took an approach that split its buttons into groups you could feel without looking down. A big B and A up front, and then 4 small yellow C buttons for camera and other actions off to the side, and then even a separate Z trigger underneath the controller. Nintendo's head designer at the time, Lance Barr, described it this way. He said, "Most games use a few buttons for most of the main controls, such as jumping and shooting, or accelerating and braking. That's why the A and B buttons are placed for easiest access on the new controller, and why they are larger than the other buttons. They're the buttons that get high traffic." So again, we see Nintendo designing for the idea of primary and secondary buttons. And Nintendo wasn't finished with this idea. When the GameCube came out, it took it even further. I mean, just look at this thing. The A became a giant green button sitting right in the middle. You couldn't make it more obvious. The B button then shrank and moved to the side. X and Y wrapped around the other side. Even though we don't know why Nintendo put B before A on the original controller for the NES, it's pretty clear that as their designs progressed, there was a method to the madness. They definitely had design priorities in mind when designing these button layouts. But the thing is, while Nintendo was using one design language, everybody else was solving the same problem using completely different languages. Here's where it becomes at least clear to me that it's really quite pointless to try to make any sense out of these controller layouts anyhow. Because first of all, just look at the genesis. Originally 3 buttons in a row, A, B, and C, red, left to right. They later released a 6-button controller with X, Y, Z for a total of 6 face buttons. This has always been my personal favorite configuration. I'd much rather have 6 face buttons than 4 face buttons and 4 shoulder buttons. Please tell me I'm not the only one, but I know I'm in the minority because this particular design did not survive. The design that ultimately would have the longest staying power is the one Sony introduced with the PlayStation, and they skipped letters entirely. Teyu Goto, who was a designer on the original PlayStation, explained it this way. He said other game companies at the time assigned alphabet letters or colors to the buttons. We wanted something simple to remember. The triangle refers to viewpoint. Square refers to a piece of paper. The circle and X represent yes or no decision making. It's ironic, isn't it, that Sony built an entirely new visual language and ran straight into the same wall anyway. Many PlayStation releases routinely flip which symbol means confirm and which means cancel. So Sony stopped using letters, but they still couldn't get developers to use their symbols in the way they were intended. Then you had the Dreamcast and eventually the Xbox. And here's where things get really confusing, because they both use the same 4 letters Nintendo has, but in the completely opposite positions. A on the bottom, B on the right. Now why Sega or Microsoft did that, nobody knows. It just happened. And it's kind of par for the course for this subject, because the deeper you dive into it, the more you find that hardly any of it makes sense. By the 2000s, it was pretty clear which controller shape had won. 4 face buttons, 2 analog sticks, 4 shoulder buttons, and a D-pad. Nearly every controller you've held in the last 20 years follows that same basic design. But the one thing that has never standardized is the labels on the face buttons. which is really quite crazy when you think about it. It's why you can pick up a controller that your hand instantly recognizes and still press the wrong button on your first try. The result is that when you tell a gamer to press a button on their controller, depending on the controller they grew up with, or the one they've spent the most time with, they will press a different button. A Nintendo gamer tends to think in terms of backwards letters. A Microsoft gamer thinks in terms of forward letters. And a Sony gamer, well, they're apparently so evolved, they don't even think in terms of letters at all. Make of that what you will. When you think about the history of video games, there are so many standards that each console manufacturer adopted and agreed upon as time went on, such as storage mediums, the use of analog sticks, memory cards, and so forth. But one thing that they have never agreed upon is how to properly label a controller's buttons. So the winning layout was never the one that made the most sense, it was just the one your thumbs likely learned first. So red still sits on top of every light you'll drive past today, and B still sits on the left of every Nintendo controller you've picked up since you were a kid. Neither one of them had to be that way, both of them just are. As time went on, controller makers agreed on how many buttons to use, what shape to make them, even where your thumb should rest by default. The one thing nobody ever agreed upon was how to label those buttons in a way that even made sense. So now I want to hear from you. Is there a button layout you feel actually makes sense? And if so, why do you feel that way? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you made it this far, thanks for watching, and happy gaming, my friends.